Elian Reyes was 7 years old the last time he saw his father's back disappearing through the front door. He remembered the way the light caught the fraying hem of his father's jacket, the heavy slam of the door, and most of all the words shouted into the walls as if they were truth itself. A man is a man, a woman is a woman. Everything else is a lie. And the television had been playing in the background, some daytime talk show flashing faces Elian didn't understand yet, faces that made his father turn red with anger. In that moment, something cracked inside the house that would never fully heal. Growing up, Elian lived with his mother, a woman who carried exhaustion like a second skin. She worked endless shifts at the local hospital, patched up scraped knees, and stitched broken skin for strangers, yet somehow could never quite sew back the frayed edges of her own small family. She loved Elian in the way she knew how, through packed lunches, late-night whispers about good dreams, and warm casseroles left in the fridge. But she rarely spoke of his father. Silence was their family heirloom. At school, Elian learned quickly what to hide. He learned that holding his arms too delicately, speaking with too much softness, or smiling too brightly would earn him looks he didn't have words for. So he practiced straightening his spine, deepening his voice, folding his wrists in stiff angles. But no matter how much he tried, there was a quietness in him that refused to be strangled. When Elian came out to his mother during his final year of high school, he expected the worst. Instead, she simply exhaled a long, tired breath and nodded. There were no tears, no declarations of support, no threats of disownment, only a small nod like closing a window before a storm, and the quiet setting of 2 plates at dinner that night, as if to say, "You are still mine." It was enough. And yet some part of Elian still burned with the need for something more, some words, some gesture that would tell him he wasn't only tolerated, but celebrated. But dreams of belonging had long been replaced by dreams of escape. College became his sanctuary and the study of law, his armor. He devoured casebooks and court rulings late into the nights, finding in the pages a language that could not be twisted by fear or shame. Laws were cold, logical, unfeeling, and therefore safe. In a world that had made him feel like an error, the law became proof that he deserved a place, a voice, a right to exist without apology. Still in the hidden places of his heart, the words of his father lived on. Whenever he stumbled, whenever he questioned himself, it was that voice he heard first. Everything else is a lie. Not just about others, about himself. No matter how far Elian ran, he realized he had never truly left that living room where a father's anger had written itself into the wallpaper. And so Elian made an unspoken vow. He would succeed not to prove his father wrong, but to prove to himself that some truths could be louder than old wounds. He would fight battles, but never ones that touched too closely to the parts of himself. Still tender, still afraid he would be a lawyer, but not that kind of lawyer. He would help those who needed contracts, written businesses, defended wrongs, rectified, safe battles, clean battles. At least that had been the plan. Until a case walked through his door one afternoon, small, trembling, and wearing the same invisible scars Elian thought he had long since hidden. And in that moment, the life he had carefully built around silence and survival would begin to crack. If Elian's story reminds you of the silent battles we all carry, stay with us. Heart Stories shares the moments when one brave step shatters generations of silence. The office smelled faintly of old coffee and floor polish, a scent Elian had grown used to in his years of scraping through small law firms, taking whatever cases came through the door. His desk was cluttered with client files, evictions, insurance claims, custody disputes, familiar battles, winnable battles. He kept his head down, built his reputation carefully, brick by cautious brick. It wasn't a glamorous life, but it was his and it was safe. That afternoon, he almost missed the knock at his door. It was soft, hesitant, like someone unsure whether they were allowed to take up space. Elian called out without looking up, expecting another landlord dispute or maybe a noise complaint. Instead, when he finally raised his eyes, he saw her. A woman with short, dark hair tucked behind her ears, hands clutched tightly around a worn manila folder. Her name was Ava Monroe. Her story came out haltingly at first, like water leaking from a cracked dam. She had trained for 2 years to join the local police department, top scores in physical training, impeccable background checks, glowing letters of recommendation. But when her birth certificate surfaced during the final vetting process marked male, the offer was quietly rescinded. No explanation given, no avenue for appeal. Just a silent dismissal that left her standing outside the academy gates watching her future disappear like mist. As Ava spoke, Elian listened, torn between a rising fury and an old familiar fear. This was exactly the kind of case he had promised himself he would never touch. Too messy, too close, too risky. Defending a transgender woman against a city department would mark him, make him a target in ways he had spent a lifetime avoiding. The world wasn't kind to people who fought battles others didn't want to acknowledge. He thanked her for coming, promised to review her documents, and watched her leave with slumped shoulders, the manila folder clutched like a life raft. When the door clicked shut behind her, Elian sat back in his chair, heart pounding for reasons he didn't want to name. For hours, he stared at the folder without opening it. He buried himself in easier cases, told himself it was better this way, safer. But when night fell and the office emptied out, when the city beyond his window blurred into smears of neon and shadow, Elian found himself reaching for the folder, almost against his will. Inside were copies of Ava's academic records, training certificates, letters from instructors describing her as an exceptional candidate and a natural leader. There were also 2 terse emails from the police department's hiring board, formal, emotionless final, no mention of her transition, no legal grounds for the rejection, just silence where opportunity had once been. Elian felt something old and brittle break loose inside him. He saw in Ava's paperwork a reflection of the battles he had fought in smaller, quieter ways all his life. Battles against being overlooked, underestimated, pushed aside not because of his abilities, but because of what he was. Not enough, too different, wrong. It would have been easier to close the file and move on, to tell himself someone else would take the case, to pretend he hadn't seen. But Elian Reyes had spent too many years learning to live with silence. He didn't want to be the man who looked away anymore. The next morning he called Ava. His voice was steady, clearer than he expected. "I'll represent you," he said. There was a long pause filled only by the soft crackle of a poor connection. When Ava spoke, her voice trembled with something fragile and devastating. "Hope, thank you," she whispered. In the weeks that followed, Elian threw himself into preparation. He researched discrimination laws, case precedents, civil rights protections with a ferocity that surprised even him. Every late night spent hunched over law books felt like striking a blow against a past he had never been able to outrun. Every argument he crafted, every motion he filed, became a stone laid on a path towards something larger than himself. The opposition came swiftly. The city filed motions to dismiss, arguing that Ava's exclusion was a matter of security and public trust, thinly veiled excuses that masked their true intent. Some of Elian's colleagues warned him to drop the case, to choose his battles wisely. He received emails without signatures, hinting that he was risking his career, and worse, his safety. There were nights Elian doubted himself, nights when he stared at the courtroom ceiling, after long hearings, wondering if he had been foolish to think one case could change anything. But then he would remember Ava's face, the way she had looked at him, not with expectation, but with the silent, desperate question that had once lived inside him too. Will anyone fight for me? Elian decided he would be the answer to that question. The trial date loomed heavy and close. Every word he would say, every shred of evidence he would offer would be weighed by a system that had never truly seen people like him, or like Ava, as fully human. But for the first time in his life, Elian didn't feel like he was fighting to prove he belonged. He was fighting because he already knew he did. And deep down, though he barely dared to admit it, even to himself, a small ember of something else began to glow. The possibility that truth once spoken aloud could be louder than even the oldest, most stubborn lie. The courthouse smelled of stale paper and linoleum polish, a scent that clung to every wall and every breath. Elian Reyes stood in the narrow hallway outside courtroom 4B, adjusting the cuffs of his shirt, his heart hammering an uneven rhythm against his ribs. Across from him, Ava sat rigidly on a bench, her palms flat against her thighs, her eyes distant but unafraid. She had not asked for sympathy, she had asked for justice. Inside the courtroom, the city's legal team waited with carefully neutral expressions, their briefcases resting against polished shoes, their ties knotted with precision. They were older, more seasoned, and carried with them the silent confidence of those who had always known the system would bend in their favor. Elian knew better than to expect fairness. He knew that walking into that room was like stepping into a storm, and he would need more than facts and laws to survive it. When the bailiff called the case, Elian followed Ava to the plaintiff's table. Every eye in the room seemed to track them, measuring, judging. Some barely concealed their disdain. Others wore polite indifference, a colder cruelty, in its own way. Elian had felt it before in school's corridors, in whispered conversations behind closed doors, in the hardening of his mother's face when neighbors asked too many questions. The judge entered. A woman in her 60s, her face set in the lines of someone who had long ago learned to hide her thoughts. Elian met her gaze only briefly enough to catch a flicker of something that might have been curiosity or caution. The city's lawyer opened with a speech about standards and public confidence, weaving phrases designed to sound objective while cloaking discrimination and respectability. He spoke of biological realities, of protecting the integrity of the force. Not once did he use Ava's name. To him, she was an abstract risk, a disruption to be managed. When it was Elian's turn, he rose slowly, feeling the weight of the room pressed down on him. He had prepared meticulously, citing federal civil rights laws, Supreme Court decisions, policies from progressive departments across the country. But as he stood there, facing not just the court, but the invisible ghost of his father's voice snarling in the back of his mind, he realized that no amount of cold logic would be enough. He had to make them see Ava as human. Elian began by telling the court about the academy records, the recommendations, the flawless training evaluations. He painted a picture, not of controversy, but of courage, not of risk, but of readiness. And then when the judge's pen paused briefly over her notes, he knew it was time to say the thing he had rehearsed 100 times, but never spoken aloud until now. He spoke of dignity. He spoke of the cost of being invisible, of fighting every day, not for special treatment, but for the right to be measured by the same standards everyone else claimed to believe in. He spoke of how easy it was to build walls around fear and call it tradition. How institutions clung to old definitions, not because they were true, but because letting them go felt too much like losing control. Somewhere deep in the middle of his argument, Elian felt it, the shift. A few jurors leaned forward, the judge's expression tight and thoughtful. Even the city's attorney shifted uncomfortably in his seat, but not everyone listened with open ears. During cross-examination, the defense hammered Ava with questions meant to reduce her identity to an error, a confusion, a trick. They forced her to recount the most painful parts of her transition, dissected her life in a way no cisgender candidate would have ever endured. Through it all, Ava sat with her shoulders squared, her voice steady, even as her hands trembled slightly in her lap. Watching her, Elian thought of his father again, the man who had refused to accept anything that did not fit neatly into his understanding of the world. A man who chose fear over love, control over curiosity. And in that courtroom, Elian made a choice. His father never had, he chose to see. In closing arguments, Elian stripped away the legal jargon. He spoke plainly, but with the force that seemed to vibrate against the windows. He asked the jury whether they wanted to live in a world where opportunity was a promise kept only for the few, or one where courage was rewarded, regardless of how uncomfortable it made the powerful. He sat down to silence so heavy it felt like a living thing. The jury deliberated for what felt like an eternity. Elian sat beside Ava, not speaking, not moving, barely breathing. He knew how thin the line was between right and reality. He had lived too long on the wrong side of that line to trust hope easily. When the jury returned, the foreperson rose with a folded slip of paper. The judge took it, read it, and for a terrible heartbeat, her face betrayed nothing. Then she spoke. In favor of the plaintiff. Ava's hands flew to her mouth. Elian closed his eyes, the courtroom spinning around him in a blur of light and muffled sound. It was over. It was won. The city would be required to compensate Ava, clear her record, and offer her the position she had earned. But the real victory was something deeper. Something not written into the judgment, the acknowledgement, however brief, that dignity could not be legislated away. As the courtroom emptied, Ava turned to him, tears slipping down her cheeks. She didn't say thank you. She didn't need to. The way she stood tall and unbroken was thanks enough. Elian gathered his papers, his hands steady now. Somewhere in the pile, tucked between affidavits and court orders, was the manila folder she had first handed him, the folder he almost left unopened. As he stepped out into the crisp afternoon air, the sun striking his face with an almost painful clarity, Elian realized something he had never dared to believe before. He had not just fought for Ava, he had fought for the boy he once was. The boy who had stood in a living room filled with anger and learned all the wrong lessons about who deserved to be seen. And in standing for Ava, he had finally stood for himself. The news broke late on a Thursday evening, just as the sun bled out behind the city's battered skyline. Elian Reyes wasn't watching when the segment aired. He was still at his desk, reviewing appeal paperwork for another client, his mind stubbornly anchored in the rituals of work, as if staying busy could keep the enormity of the verdict at bay. It was his mother who saw it first. She called him, her voice thick with emotion, asking if he was home. Within the hour, she was standing in his doorway, a plastic bag of groceries swinging from one hand, her shoes still wet from the rain. She said nothing about the story. Instead, she unpacked bread, fruit, a half-gallon of milk, stacking them neatly in his fridge, as if grounding herself in the small, ordinary things would keep the bigger, more complicated emotions from overwhelming her. Only when she finished did she finally meet his eyes and say simply, "I saw you." On the television behind her, a replay of the news report flickered footage from outside the courthouse. A reporter breathlessly recounting how a young lawyer had successfully challenged one of the city's most entrenched hiring practices. Ava was in the shot too, her face shining with quiet triumph. The camera panned briefly to Elian, standing to the side, papers tucked under one arm, his expression unreadable. For the first time, the city saw him not as a footnote, not as a stereotype, but as a force that could not be ignored. His mother wiped her hands on a dish towel and turned back to him, her voice lower now, almost reverent. "I'm proud of you, mijo." There were no grand speeches, no outpourings of sentiment, just those words stitched carefully into the fabric of a life where so many things had gone unsaid, and somehow that was enough. For a while, they sat together in the fading light, the quiet between them no longer heavy with fear, but buoyed by something almost like peace. It should have ended there. It would have been a good ending, a mother and son, a shared victory, a small, hard-won homecoming. But life, Elian knew, rarely honored such simple narratives. The phone rang just after midnight. He let it buzz twice before he even looked at it, his body sluggish with the thick, heavy exhaustion that only followed great battles. When he saw the number unknown out of state, his stomach tightened. Something old and brittle stirred inside him. Something he thought he had buried years ago. He almost didn't answer. Almost, but his hand moved anyway, driven by a force older than anger, older than grief, the stubborn, aching hope that maybe, just maybe, some wounds could still be healed. The voice on the other end was rougher than he remembered, worn down by cigarettes and regret. "Elian," a pause, the weight of a lifetime pressing against a single syllable. "It's your father." Elian sat perfectly still, the phone burning against his ear. In the background, he could hear the low hum of a television, the faint sound of the same news broadcast playing somewhere far away. "I saw what you did," the voice said. I didn't understand. I didn't want to understand. I thought I was protecting you. I thought I was protecting myself." A ragged breath, "But I was wrong." The words stumbled out awkwardly, unfinished. They were not a confession. They were not an absolution. They were simply a man's belated attempt to name the thing that had broken between them. Elian closed his eyes. He wanted to feel rage. He wanted to spit every hurt back through the receiver. He wanted to say it was too late. But sitting there with the city spread out beneath his window and the ghost of his childhood pressing at his back, he realized something far simpler. He didn't need his father's apology to validate who he had become. He had already proven it, to himself, to Ava, to the world. And maybe, just maybe, hearing the words, even broken and late, could still matter. He spoke quietly, his voice steady in a way it had never been during all those silent years. "I didn't win for you," he said. "I won because she deserved it. And because I deserved to stand up for something that mattered." There was another silence, this one different, heavier, with something that might have been acceptance or surrender. "I know," his father said, barely audible. Elian let the silence stretch between them, a bridge too fragile to cross, yet real enough to acknowledge. When he finally ended the call, he didn't feel triumphant. He didn't feel defeated either. He felt clean. The past hadn't been rewritten. The scars hadn't been erased. But something fundamental had shifted, like a door once bolted shut, cracking open, letting in a shaft of light. He sat for a long time staring at the darkened screen of his phone before finally setting it down beside him. Outside, the city moved on, indifferent and endless. Somewhere in the distance, a siren wailed sharp against the night. Elian Reyes leaned back in his chair, his hands loose in his lap, and for the first time in his life, He allowed himself to believe that not all broken things stayed broken forever. Some of them, just some, could be rebuilt piece by the ones who chose to try. The weeks that followed the trial blurred into a mosaic of interviews, speaking requests, and cautious congratulations from corners Elian Reyes never expected. His name appeared in headlines he never thought would carry. It tied now to something larger than the lonely boy who had once stood invisible in his own home. Yet even as the recognition grew, Elian felt no hunger to bask in it. Fame had never been the prize he sought. What mattered now was what he could build from the ground he had fought to clear. He began small. Late at night, after court hearings and endless paperwork, he sketched out plans for something he had once only dared to dream of. A foundation, a legal network dedicated to defending those whose existence had been treated as a technicality to be erased. He called it the Reyes Initiative, not out of vanity, but out of a quiet reclamation of a name that had once felt like a chain. Through the initiative, Elian offered free legal aid to transgender individuals facing workplace discrimination, police harassment, housing denial. He trained young law students, especially those from marginalized communities, to become the kind of advocates he wished he had known existed when he was younger. He taught them not only how to argue a case, but how to carry the invisible weight of histories that were still being rewritten with every verdict. One afternoon, sitting alone in his modest office, Elian received a letter. Not an email, not a typed memo, but a handwritten letter on thick, slightly smudged paper. It was from Ava. She had completed her training and been sworn in as an officer, the first openly transgender woman to serve in the city's department. At the end of the letter, she had written in bold, looping handwriting, "Because you stood up, I can stand too." Elian folded the letter carefully and placed it inside the same manila folder that had once held her first desperate plea. It was not a trophy, it was a reminder that change, real change, was stitched together from 1,000 small choices made by people who refused to stay silent. Years later, when asked in interviews what moment made him most proud, Elian never spoke about the courtroom victory or the national attention, or even the call from a father he had thought lost to bitterness. Instead, he would talk about the quiet mornings when a new client, nervous and trembling, would walk through his door, about the moments when he could look them in the eye and say without hesitation, "You have a place here. You have someone who will stand for you." Standing in front of a class of future lawyers, one crisp autumn day, Elian looked out over the sea of young faces, some eager, some skeptical, all hopeful in ways they barely allowed themselves to admit, and realized something simple and breathtaking. He had become what he once needed most. As the students packed their bags, he offered a final thought, his voice steady, but carrying the weight of every step that had brought him here. "Power doesn't come from being louder than others," he said. "It comes from refusing to let the world convince you that you were never meant to speak." Oyam. The room held stillness like a held breath, and in that stillness, Elian Reyes smiled, not because the journey was easy, not because every battle had been won, but because somewhere along the way he had learned that true victory was not a single moment or a headline. It was a life lived without apology, a life finally fully his own. Have you ever had to stand up for yourself or someone else when it felt easier to stay silent? What gave you the courage to speak? If Elian's story moved you, imagine how many more stories are waiting to be heard. Subscribe to Heart Stories to keep the light alive for those still finding their voice.